Orbiting Jupiter, Chapter 2. Not all the teachers believed Joseph shouldn't be at Eastham Middle School. Coach Swiatek thought he was terrific. When we got to the apparatus unit in the middle of November, Coach found out Joseph could do stuff better than any of the other 8th graders. Better than any 8th grader he had ever coached before. Do a flip on the trampoline? Joseph could throw a double. Do a handstand on the parallel bars? Not a problem. And Joseph could balance on one hand for longer than you'd think. Vault over the pommel horse? Easy. Joseph added a twist. Really, a twist. Climb the rope to the ceiling in under 60 seconds? Joseph climbed it in 38 without using his legs. Which was the only thing Coach could show him how to do himself, because Coach had lost both his legs to a landmine in Vietnam a long time ago. The first time they raced to the ceiling and back, Coach Swiatek won by 4 seconds. The second time, Joseph beat him by 3. It was Joseph's third smile. Sort of. Don't crow, said Coach. All you did was beat a legless man by 2 seconds. 3, said Joseph, still smiling. Sort of. 3, said Coach. Then he looked at the rest of the 8th graders, and all the 7th and 6th graders too. And that legless old man can still beat the rest of you by a whole lot more than 3 seconds. So let's get to work. And just so you know, I could do the rope in under 2 minutes, which hardly any other 6th grader could do. And so what if I had to use my legs? You're allowed. Mr. DeAulney was also glad Joseph was at Eastham Middle. Mr. DeAulney taught 6th, 7th, and 8th grade math. He loved numbers and what they did and even how they looked, and sometimes he couldn't figure out why the rest of us didn't love them as much as he did. But I mean, who could love an equation except for Mr. DeAulney? On a day that Mr. DeAulney had bus monitor duty, I met Joseph at the end of the bus line and had to wait. Mr. DeAulney was asking Joseph questions. Geometry questions. Really, geometry questions. Joseph knew them all, I think, or he could figure them out. The next day, during 5th period office duty, Mr. DeAulney saw Joseph and me sitting on the office duty bench doing nothing, which is what most office duty periods were. So he scribbled a bunch of stuff on a pad and handed it to Joseph. "Can you prove this theorem?" he said. Joseph took the pad. He worked on it the whole period. When the bell rang, he took the pad to Mr. DeAulney's classroom. After that, Mr. DeAulney brought a new theorem to 5th period office duty every day. He would hand it to Joseph, and Joseph would get to work. Once Mr. Cannon saw Mr. DeAulney handing over the new theorem, and he said, "These boys are on office duty." Mr. DeAulney turned to face him. "Of course," he said. "It's so much more important for them to run around the school dropping off messages than be challenged to learn what great mathematicians have wrestled with for thousands of years." "You'd think they would have solved those problems by now," said Mr. Canton. "It's not the solution, Mr. Canton. It's the path to the solution that's fascinating," said Mr. DeAulney. He left, and Mr. Canton went into his office. He came out with 15 slips of paper, folded over. "You need to deliver these," he said. "When you get back, I want to clean up the attendance files." After that day, we were pretty busy during 5th period office duty. So Joseph began to eat lunch in Mr. DeAulney's room. Mr. DeAulney said that maybe by the end of the school year, he'd throw in a little trig at him. Those were the 2 teachers who liked Joseph. Joseph never talked about his family, but I met his father. Joseph wasn't home because he was at counseling. We were getting ready to milk, and I was cleaning the stalls in the big barn when suddenly he was right next to me, standing by the manure traps. As soon as I saw him, I knew he was Joseph's father. Same black eyes. "Joe around?" he said. The cows looked over, and their eyes got big, and their tails swished, and they started to hold their heads up and moo, which means they're pretty upset. Cows don't like strangers near the tie-up. They especially don't like strangers near the tie-up when they're about to be milked, unless they're the right kind of strangers, like Joseph was. "No," I said. "They got you doing chores, huh?" he said. "What are you here for?" Dahlia stamped her hind foot. When Dahlia stamps her hind foot, you know she's really upset. I live here, I said. I figure you lived here. I mean before. The milk pails clanged down behind me. It was my father. He was rubbing Dahlia's rump because she loves it almost as much as Rosie does. It always calms her right down. You Joseph's father, he said? That's right. My father nodded. Jack, he said, you come back over here and spread some more shavings for Rosie, would you? Then he said to Joseph's father, you're not supposed to be here. I came to see what kind of hellhole they put my son into. Like I said, you're not supposed to be here. You have him shoveling manure too? Is that what you get out of this? A bunch of kids who have to shovel manure for you? My father took his glasses off and rubbed his eyes. We're taking good care of Joseph, he said. And now it's time for you to go. You know I can. I'm sure you can, but like I said, now it's time for you to go. My father put his glasses back on and they looked at each other for a while. Then Joseph's father said a few words I'm not allowed to say, and he looked at me. When my father took a step toward him, he said a few more words I'm not allowed to say, and left. Dahlia was watching the whole time. If Joseph's father had come within range, you know he'd have limped out of that barn. Like I said, you can tell a whole lot about someone from the way cows are around him. By the end of November, it looked like my father was right. We were in for a wicked winter. It snowed hard on Thanksgiving Day, maybe 9 or 10 inches, and then another couple of inches over the weekend, and it was cold. 15 on Thanksgiving Day, 10 on the Saturday after, and then up to 12 on Sunday. A regular heat wave, said my father. When it's that cold, you're glad to lean into your warm cow in the morning. And Joseph did, after rubbing Rosie's rump and listening to her say she loved him. He always milked her first now, morning and afternoon. Sometimes I wondered if he was still so slow at it just because she loved him and told him so, and Joseph didn't want to hurry any of that up. Maybe. It stayed cold that Monday, and even though it was pretty bright out, there were snowflakes in the air that afternoon again, drifting like they didn't care if they landed. The bus passed us at Old First Congregational while we were heading home. Its windows were all fogged up, but I could hear Mr. Haskell yelling at John Wall over the diesel to close that window, close it right now, because John Wall had opened it to throw a snowball he'd smuggled aboard. His throw, by the way, didn't even come close, probably because he didn't throw off his back foot. The bus rolled off through the high snow, and when it was gone, everything around us was only white. The ground, the trees, the clapboard of the church, the sky, even the Alliance was frozen white. And maybe that's why Joseph dropped his backpack on the road, clambered into the high snow, and headed down to the river. I followed him. If you don't know the river, it's easy to miss where the bank ends and the river begins. And the Alliance flows pretty fast, so it doesn't wear safe ice until winter has hung around for a while, and it gets deep quicker than any river has a right to. I didn't think Joseph knew the river. The snow was thick, but Joseph was breaking a path through it, so it slowed him down more than me. Even so, he stepped onto the ice before I reached the bank. Joseph, what are you doing? Figure it out, Jackie. His other foot onto the ice. I thumped through the snow alongside. He shoved against his back foot and skidded along the ice, heading up the river, me following on the bank. You know, I said, this is pretty new ice. He didn't answer. He shoved again, and that second time he didn't slide alongside the bank. He slid out toward the middle of the river, where the ice was darker. Joseph, I'm not kidding. It was like I wasn't even there. The wind came up hard, and Joseph unzipped his coat and held it out like wings, but it didn't push him along, so he shoved against his back foot again, and the ice was slicker now, and he spun twice and shoved again toward the dark center. Joseph! I think it must have sounded like I was crying or screaming. Maybe I was doing both, but however it sounded, Joseph looked at me. Then he turned back toward the dark ice. So I screamed the name I'd heard him say in the dark of the night. The name I'd heard him say again and again. Maddie! Maddie! He turned toward me. And the way he looked at me, I don't ever want anyone to look at me like that again. But he was so close to the dark ice. Maddie, I said. Shut up, he said. Shut up! I stood on the bank of the Alliance in all that white and waited for Joseph to come. But he didn't move. He did not move. On the road above us, a car drove past. Another car, and then another. But this one stopped, a voice crying out, Hey, you idiot kids! What are you doing down there? Get off the ice! Joseph looked up at the driver, then started to jump up and down, hard, pounding at the ice. The car drove away. Joseph stopped jumping. Suddenly he looked like he was all tired out. Joseph, I said. He looked at me again, and he started to come back, one tired step after another. He wasn't sliding at all. Every step, the ice got whiter. The winter I was 6, I saw a yellow dog on the thin ice on the Alliance. I was with my mother, and we were walking back from a breakfast potluck at First Congregational, before it became Old First Congregational. The yellow dog was out farther onto the ice than Joseph, but not much, and it had fallen through, and its eyes were huge, and it was grabbing on with its front paws, scratching, looking for something to hold on to. It wasn't making a sound. I told my mother we had to go get it, but she held my arm so I wouldn't go down to the river. Her other hand she held over her mouth. Once the dog almost got out, but the ice broke under it again, and it was scratching like anything, until suddenly it stopped, put its head down on the ice, slid into the dark water, and was gone. Gone. I live on a farm. I see animals die all the time. Never like that. I cried about the yellow dog every night for I don't know how long. I dreamed about the dog. I dreamed about me being that dog. And the cold water under the ice pulling my legs and dragging at me. And then my hands getting so cold they wouldn't work. And then the moment when I put my head down on the ice and slid into the dark water. I always woke up then, sweating, wondering if I really had screamed or not. That's why it felt like a nightmare when Joseph, maybe 3 steps away from the bank, fell through the ice of the Alliance River. He didn't go under. He spread out his arms and caught himself, but the water splashed up around him, and he went in almost to his shoulders, and his eyes got huge, just like the yellow dog's, and you could almost see the current pulling his legs, and he started to reach for the shore, scratching at the ice, scratching at the ice. I might have screamed. I took off my backpack and dumped everything out into the snow. Joseph still scratching. I put one foot out onto the ice. He was only 3 steps away, and held on to the end of a strap and tossed the backpack out to him, and felt my foot go through the ice and into the water and onto some rocks. You can't believe how strong the current was under the ice, even just up to my knee. I might have screamed again, but Joseph had one end of the backpack. Hold it! I hollered. He tried to pull himself up onto the ice, but his left hand went through and he almost went under. I leaned toward the bank, pulling on the backpack, and felt my other foot slide down into the dark water and the current yanking at both knees. I'm pretty sure I screamed then. Joseph tried to push himself up on the other side, and that ice held. I pulled back on the backpack, and his chest came up to the ice. Back up, he hollered, back up! But I couldn't back up. The water was rushing, and if I took my feet away from the rocks beneath them, I didn't know what would happen. Maybe I'd slide under like the yellow dog? Joseph's whole body was up on the ice now. He bellied up to the bank and rolled over onto the snow. He reached and grabbed my coat, and he pulled, and I felt my feet leaving the rocks, and for a second I might have screamed again. But then my back was up onto the bank, and I was trying to kick, which isn't so easy when your legs have been in freezing water, you know. And then my heels were going into the snow and not into the water, and I stopped screaming. "Are you crazy?" I yelled. Joseph stood and shook his whole body like a dog spraying the water away, but he was still soaked. Already his hair was freezing into black strands. "You are crazy," I yelled again. Joseph wiped the water from his face. I stood too and picked up everything I had dumped out of my backpack, which was now as soaked as Joseph was, and already freezing too. "This is how people die," I said. "They fall into the water and get dragged under the ice, or they make it out and freeze to death." "Then we better get back to your house, Jackie," he said. "It's Jack," I said. "Yeah," said Joseph. "Why did you—" "We're out now," he said, and started up toward the road. But his lips were already turning kind of blue, and he walked like his pants were frozen, which they probably were. Mine were. So maybe it wasn't such a bad thing that when we got to the top, Mr. Canton was driving up. He looked at us through his windshield like we really were the most complete jerks he had ever seen. He stopped the car and rolled down his window. "Get in the back seat," he said, and I got in, and Joseph picked up his backpack and got in, and he shut the door, and Mr. Canton turned the heater to high. If someone hadn't called the school about 2 crazy kids out on the ice, I wouldn't have come here. He turned around and looked at Joseph. It wasn't too hard to figure out who it would be either. Then he looked at me, and I guess you know what he was saying without him saying it. "Take off your coats and your sweaters too," he said. Mr. Canton drove us home. When we stopped, he told us he'd be talking to us about this during 5th period office duty. "Something for you two to look forward to," he said. You can imagine what my mother did when we got inside. "Stand in front of the wood stove," she said. "Everything that's wet off," she said. "Quickly," she said. She ran upstairs and brought back the red woolen blankets from the hall cedar chest, the scratchy ones. "Underwear too," she said. "It's not like there's anything I haven't seen." She handed us the blankets. "Put these around you and stand there," she said. Joseph took the red woolen blanket and looked at it. Then he wrapped it tightly around himself. My mother fussed around the stove and poured 2 cups of hot chocolate. "Drink this," she said. "Is there any coffee left over from?" Joseph said. "You're too young," she said. Joseph drank the hot chocolate. When my father got back, you can imagine what he did too, mostly at me. "Jack, what do I tell you every winter? Don't go out onto the ice until you say it's safe." "Did I say it was safe?" "No, sir." "No, I didn't." "Quiet, Joseph. I'll talk to you in a minute. Of all the brainless, fool things to do for a boy who has lived near a river all his life, this was the most brainless, the most fool thing you could come up with. If for 1 minute I could—" "He came onto the ice for me," said Joseph. My father turned his face slowly toward Joseph. "That's what we'll be talking about," he said. I don't need to tell you the rest. It had a lot to do with thinking through things and making smart decisions and not taking dumb risks for no reason at all. And in fact, not taking dumb risks, period. And I can't tell you what my father said to Joseph since he sent me to the kitchen to get going on homework. But when they were done, Joseph came and sat down next to me. He opened Physical Science Today and flipped through the pages. "Sorry, Jackie," he said. "That's all." "Jack," I said. He took out his calculator and got to work. That night, it was cold in our room, and I was still sort of chilled, so I got into bed and under the covers about as quickly as a human being can do it. But when Joseph was ready, he stood by my bed, leaned his arms against the upper bunk, and looked down at me. Maybe it was because of the freezing water, but for the first time I could see his scar clearly. The white line dragged down from under his right arm, then jagged along his whole side and into his sweatpants. I wondered if it went all the way down his leg. "Jackie?" he said. "Jack," I said. "Don't worry about Kenton. Your father's going to call him. You'll be all right." I wasn't worried. I know. I wasn't. I know. My stomach unknotted a little bit because I had been worried. A whole lot worried. Joseph shifted onto his other foot. Probably the wood floor was pretty cold. And Jackie, don't ever say Maddie again, okay? Her name is Madeline. No one ever calls her Maddie except me. Okay. So don't say it again. Okay, I said. Okay. He went across to the desk and turned the light off. It was freezing, but he stood at the window, looking up at the night sky, his hand up against the cold pane. Then finally, he came over and climbed up onto his bunk. He lay without moving for a long while. Joseph, I said, after a while. Yeah? Why did you go out on the ice? After another while, Maddie liked to skate, he said. Then we both lay without moving. End of chapter 2.